Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Randy Bach. Today is March 21st, 2024. It's the first day of spring, last day of winter, one of those things, or nearabouts. It's the this is the vernal equinox. And I have with me Jonathan Leaf, the author of City of Angels, which is I guess, kind of a crime thriller. It has lots of intrigue in it. And I think as you get going, you really capture the essence of kind of the avarice and motivations in Hollywood. And he's on to bigger and better things, or different things at the very least. And I'd like to talk about some of his forays currently. You're writing a novel and also a history of philosophy or philosophers.
Yeah, so during the COVID pandemic, I'm mostly known as a playwright. I've had, I guess now 8 plays produced off-Broadway and off-Broadway, as well as in France and on the West Coast. And so during the pandemic, it was impossible to get anything produced as a playwright. So I worked on a couple other books, and one is a novel that I'm now serializing on Substack, and one is a history of philosophy, which I'm rewriting and serializing on Substack. So my publisher of this mystery novel that you mentioned, mystery thriller, City of Angels, asked me to do a Substack. I started doing it and been having a lot of fun, and have discovered I'm actually making money from it, completely unexpected. And so, yeah, I'd love to talk about it. And I'd also like to remind viewers of this podcast that they should go out and buy our host, Randy Bach's excellent book on Zika, which I want to write about soon, which exposes it's a fascinating story, and it exposes a real scandal in our healthcare system. So let me very, very pointedly note that.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to see if I can pop it up for people very briefly here. There it is, the beast, overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. If we had paid, some attention to this early on, I don't think we would have fallen for the same trick, unless it's like Charlie, or Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football. I don't think it would have happened the same way.
Though it should be pointed out for people who are not familiar with what you're saying in your book. There's no question that COVID was a novel virus. Whether it was handled in a way that was appropriate and reasonable is a completely different matter, but it was a novel virus. I think the point you're making is that Zika was not a novel virus, and it was exaggerated and exploited by people for various reasons.
It's true enough. Yeah, we're not going to, maybe a little bit at the end, we'll talk about mine, but I'd rather talk about your books, and I'll pop one up here just for people to see. So here's the aforementioned City of Angels.
And I just want to shamelessly mention on my own behalf that the book has gotten tremendous reader response and wonderful reviews from critics, including the notoriously difficult folks at Kirkus Reviews said, and I quote, they called it lighthearted literary entertainment at its best. So, yeah, people will enjoy it.
Yeah, for my own taste, I mean, it took me a little bit to get into it, but once you're there, it's rollicking along, and I think you have really astute observations of the industry about how people act and operate, and I thought it was a very interesting tale of that, and it's quite humorous at times as well. So, bravo for that. And I've been reading lately some of the other Substack posts you've had, and maybe you can tell us, I don't know, how you got interested in that topic. Is it a publisher-promoted concept that you're filling in the gap? And what are you finding out? I kind of wouldn't mind doing, kind of baseball card version of philosophers. What we need to know and whom we should follow and why.
Well, I think that there's been a corruption of the field of philosophy. And that was one of the inspirations for writing the book. Philosophy, as people probably know or can guess, comes from Greek love of wisdom. And it's supposed to be the love of wisdom or the study of wisdom. But a lot of the things that are being taught in the academy these days are not wise and really have nothing to do with this very esoteric stuff. But they're not wisdom. And this not only includes a lot of stuff that's written in the last 150 years, like Heidegger and Wittgenstein, the value of which I think is very debatable. But even one of the points I make is Plato's Republic, which is regarded as this touchstone, is a work that, first off, the ideas in it are ridiculous, but it was not actually regarded as an important philosophical work until fairly recently. This is something, at least historically speaking, it wasn't even translated into English until 1763. Most of the important English language philosophers, Hume, Locke, etc., never read it. Hobbes certainly did. I think there's no question about that. The idea that it's a fundamental work of philosophy with which one must quote unquote engage is actually by historical standards, it's actually a fairly recent idea. And many of the defenses that have been made of its importance are peculiar. Since there's one that's often advanced by people who are followers of a guy named Leo Strauss, they say, well, it wasn't actually intended seriously. It was a philosophical jest. And you're supposed to respond to it as a philosophical jest. We know enough about Plato's life to realize, no, it was in fact meant completely in earnest. It just has a lot of very strange ideas in it, including this whole idea of the philosopher king and the training of a group of philosopher kings, et cetera, et cetera. But if we think of philosophy as the study of wisdom, it's not clear exactly how it fits in the way that, let's say, Montesquieu does, or de Tocqueville, or for that matter, Machiavelli, Locke. It doesn't really seem to fit in that way.
So that's interesting. So maybe you could just kind of give us a little shading on what the Republic propounded, how it did that, and then how that differs from the Montesquieu, Locke, de Tocqueville, that maybe are somewhat more reality based. We'll say. I don't know.
Yeah. Plato was, as a very young man, he became part of a circle that included Socrates. And what we know of Socrates indicates that he was a person of very high moral character, but he was also a very strange guy. He had been a stonemason. He came into an inheritance. He quit being a stonemason, and he attracted this kind of clique of followers, many of whom were very disreputable. A number of them later became the leaders of a group called the 30 Tyrants. These were people who overthrew the democracy of Athens with the support of Sparta, following this thing called the Peloponnesian War. They killed an enormous number of people in a city that probably had between 50 and 80,000 citizens. They killed about 3,000 people in 6 months. They stole most of the wealth of the city. They were really bad guys. And they included many of Socrates' followers. Now, Socrates was an enemy of democracy. He was very critical of democracy. He believed that an ideal republic was not a democracy, that it was some sort of totalitarian state in which there would be no music, there would be poetry. The government would strictly censor what people could read. Only people trained in philosophy would be allowed to rule. And we at least have hints that this is what they were trying to set up. And then Plato, who was related to several of these people, he was probably first cousin once removed, the leader of the 30 Tyrants, and he seems to have been related to several others. And he also went to school among this clique of Socrates followers with this notorious guy named Alcibiades, who was a traitor who served Sparta, though he'd been an Athenian general. So he, with his pals, they were all admirers of Socrates. And then he wrote the Republic, which presents Socrates' ideas. And it's an attack on democracy. It presents the Periclean age as bad. It's a time period that we usually think of as, one of the heights of civilization, when vast discoveries in math and science were made, particularly in the area of geometry. Also the time period which the Parthenon was built, and Phidias and Praxiteles were doing these amazing sculptures, and Euripides and Sophocles were writing these amazing plays. This period that's usually regarded as one of the high points in human civilization, also a period of one of the richest periods in terms of economic status of the entirety of ancient history. This he thought was all bad. He thought an ideal state was something quite different, and Plato kind of lays out these series of ideas. So how is this fundamentally different than Montesquieu, de Tocqueville? Well, they were writing about the real world. and they were describing how the real world functioned well. They were interested in ancient history. They were interested in the history of their own time, and they were writing to some degree sociologically about how to make it function better. So Montesquieu is the one that we know for the whole idea of separation of powers, which I think anyone observationally would see is, an important concept in how government functions best, how society functions best. And he took it not only from observation
of crucial element, maybe the most crucial element, because humans like to accrete power.
Yep. And he'd lived in England for a couple of years, but he'd also lived under Louis XIV and Louis XV, and he'd seen that England worked a lot better. He'd read a lot about Roman history, and he wrote about all these subjects. And he had to do he had to express a lot of his ideas anonymously. And it was only later that people recognized that he had done them. He couldn't do them openly because Louis XV could have arrested him and taken his lands away from him. He was an aristocrat. But his ideas were hugely influential. In fact, they found, other than the Bible, that Montesquieu was the single biggest influence in colonial America in the years leading up to the American Revolution in terms of how often he was quoted as a source of wisdom. And obviously was a great source of wisdom. But it's like the best science, it's empirical. It's based on, what is the actual evidence. And you could say, well, there are great scientists who've developed ideas theoretically, but what you find is they always presented ways in which their ideas could be proven. So as you probably know, Newton said, my theories of gravitation can be proven. Here's how they can be proven. The circumference of the Earth will be is greater at the equator than it is at the going from the poles. If my theories are correct, which that turned out to be true. Einstein said, if my theory of relativity is correct, when you see Mercury in the night sky during a total solar eclipse, you will notice that it's displaced in the sky. Its apparent position will be displaced in the sky. And that turned out to be true. So you can prove the ideas. And that's really important. And talking about your work and a lot of the work you've done as not only a doctor, but a writer, I know that one of your areas of criticism, writing for, forgive me, the name of the website, but one of the things that you've exposed having to do with the treatment of COVID was that so much of what was claimed had no evidence behind it, and in fact was invented out of whole cloth.
Brownstone.org.
Yeah, and I wondered if
I've written Brownstone.
I'm flattered that
I've written for the Daily Skeptic.
Say a little about that.
Say what?
I'm flattered that you're interviewing me. I'm grateful and flattered, but I wonder if you'd say a little about that.
Well, what would you like to know?
Well, maybe direct people to your website.
Well, fair enough. I'll do that. It's randybach.com. Easy enough if you know how to spell my name. I'll see if I can find it here. But it's not the best website on earth. But probably professionalized a little bit, but it's a nice looking one. It has a lot of my videos and whatnot, and some of the articles and so forth. I'll see if I can pull that up. But I've also written for the Daily Skeptic, and I think, and for some blogs as well. But the one that if I had to really push one, this is from September 2022, and it's called "Is it time to accept that Omicron is not COVID-19?" The seminal point there is 19. It's 2019. That article I wrote in 2022, and even now I still see people, running around with masks on. It's really kind of an amazing thing how much the world has been captured by falsity. And as far as my webpage, here it is, that handsome guy, and I've got a lot of the audios, videos that have come up, over time, and I've got. You can follow my Zika book and COVID-19 articles and so forth. So there's there's stuff there, but I think there's just been grinding away at what is reality. We can't express what reality is. So obviously Orwellian. That even physicians now. I was at a doctor's appointment, and I think it's pretty much inarguable that I'm a man at this point. I was a boy at some point, but I'm a man. And one of the forms for one of these groups, I had to file my sex down. It's like, and there was obviously there were multiple choice, not just two. It's like you don't want to say you're this, you're that, you're the he, she, he, non-binary, whatever, all this kind of stuff. But if you're going for medicine, you can live whatever pantomime you want out in the world, I guess. When you're going in for a medical problem, it's not going to be. I mean, a lot of things don't really matter. Your heart, your liver, it's not really a man's heart or a man liver versus a woman. But there are obviously sex-based differences. You're not going to like do breast cancer screening to the same extent for men. Obviously, there is like a 1 in 200, relative probability a man get some form of breast cancer, but certainly women don't get prostate cancer and so forth. And the whole timing of things and how you're going to like deal with issues are different for men and women. So there's like a fundamental difference. Every raccoon, every squirrel on Earth, comes in just two sexes. And they haven't reached the incredible sophistication we have. And so this kind of comes back to philosophy in a way. How much ideas can help and or pollute the underlying system you have. And I think it's really been hugely bollocksed up, as the British might say, by taking away some firm knowledge and grasp of what is and isn't in the medical schools and hospitals and so forth. I was just in the hospital. I was mentioning, I'm kind of hoping to recover from this muscle tear I have in my inner thigh, groin area. And so I was in the hospital yesterday morning. I didn't want to be there. I was up at 5 a.m. in pain. Anyway, it was very nice. Place was awesome. People are good. But everybody who comes in is wearing a mask. At least now they take it off. When they're in the nursing station, take it off. And you don't get to see anybody's faces. And I think that's not helpful. I just don't think it makes for good relationships. And anyway, it's just a silly thing. I asked, the doctor how long we're going to, you're going to be wearing those in 10 years from now. He's like, oh my God, I hope it was just stop in 10 minutes. I'm totally on your side. But he didn't want to do it, but that's why I want to keep my job. So a lot of things in science and whatnot have become this, like a little bit like aristocracy or monarchy and whatnot, where you're either in the group or not. And maybe I come back to what you call the philosopher king. I think everyone wants to be a philosopher king. That is, their king as long as they're part of this special guild. If you're only going to choose your kings amongst the philosophers. And I think in every aspect of what we're seeing out in the, say, science and journalism and, a bunch of other fields, is that you have to kind of say what the group says. And I think that goes to, ethnicity to a certain point. If you're Black and you're conservative, you're an Uncle Tom. You kind of like we've lost this individuality sense. We've lost economic sense. We've lost a lot of senses, and it's all there for us to be had and to be consumed by people interested. So the question I would like,
I couldn't agree. I mean, I think one of the unacknowledged things about our species is that unlike chimps and gorillas, we're basically a herd animal, and it's been historically a problem in science as well as in the humanities and journalism. I mean, a famous example I suspect about is the Semmelweis. He did all this research showing that washing your hands before surgery was prophylactic, and because it was not accepted wisdom, nobody wanted to do it, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people died because it took decades for Semmelweis's ideas to be accepted. And there are many other cases in the history of science of this kind of thing where, someone was ridiculed despite the fact they had clear empirical evidence of what they were saying. And journalism, I think, of all occupations, essentially because we rely on journalists to inform us about what's going on, but they may be the worst in terms of herd thinking. And I don't think this is a recent phenomenon. I think this is the nature of the occupation. It attracts people who are highly social, people who want to be liked, who want attention, kind of like actors, which is to say they're people who are not naturally inclined to think for themselves. They think of themselves as independent in nature, but most of them are not. And they kind of mindlessly repeat things, whether from official sources or from each other. And occasionally we get enough sources of information from journalism that we can begin to investigate what they tell us, but often not. And, we saw that during the COVID epidemic very clearly.
So where do you get? Well, actually, before we move on, I kind of was sticking on philosophers temporarily. I really like Adam Smith, and I don't know as much about Montesquieu. Can you tell us if there's any overlap philosophically, and what their different eras and backgrounds were that kind of made them a little bit more, we'll say, rational.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in the series of articles I've been doing about the history of philosophy, and they're kind of telling it as a story. I mean, one of the inspirations for writing it was something I read in high school, Will Durant's Story of Philosophy, which is very much an entertaining history of philosophy. It's a little dated now. It was written over about 100 years ago, though it's one of the best-selling books about philosophy ever written, maybe the best-selling book. But I did talk at some length about Smith, and one of the points I made was that people tend to think of economics as not philosophy, but there is a profound overlap. In fact, they refer to economists as the worldly philosophers, and economics is the discipline where you think about the production and distribution of resources, which is one of the basic questions of political philosophy. I mean, it's one of the things that Plato was talking about. He just didn't know anything about it. He didn't understand it. And, we think of Smith is often referred to as the father of modern economics. So, he's an absolutely pivotal figure, not only in economics, but by extension with philosophy. And yes, their lives overlapped. I don't think there's any evidence they ever met. But I think Smith's ideas are very important. And of course, Smith started out as someone who was expressly writing about philosophy. His theory of moral sentiments, which is not an argument for laissez-faire economics at all, is a work, quite pointedly, quite specifically, a work of philosophy. And David Hume was one of his best friends by the end of his life. So, he should be thought of as much as a philosopher as an economist. And one other thing I'd say about Smith that's very, very worth noting, if you read The Wealth of Nations, which most people don't, they have opinions about it, but they've actually never read it. It begins by describing a pin factory. Now, and he talks about how the pin factory operates. There are many other things like that in the book, which are based on field research. And he describes how the pin factory works and how labor and technology increases output tremendously. Now, people think of pin factory as low tech, but in his time, it was the equivalent of like going to a semiconductor factory. It was very high technology. It used steam labor. It used steam machines. It was actually a very high-tech manufacturer. And it's a real contrast, by the way, with Karl Marx. Marx was not really interested in reading more than a few economists. He did read Smith. He did read David Ricardo. In fact, he's actually the person who came up with the term classical economics. He didn't read any of his contemporaries, so he had no understanding of price theory or marginal utility, a lot of the basic ideas in economics. But unlike Smith, he never did any field research. Smith went out and actually went into factories, found out how they operated. He went out in the field. He learned how the economy actually works. Marx is the exact opposite. Until nearly the end of his life, when he went on a trip to Carlsbad, Germany to visit a spa on vacation, he'd actually never, it seems, been in a factory, ever. I mean, this was the main subject of his writing, was the rise of factory work and the industrial proletariat. But he'd never been in a factory. In fact, there's even a letter from his co-writer and friend, Friedrich Engels, whose family owned factories, and Engels invited him to go visit a factory, and it appears he never did. So that's another example of this whole phenomenon we're talking about. Pseudo-philosophers who are uninterested in the real world. They're just interested in postulating opinions and taking on the role of philosopher kings and promoting the idea of autocracy or totalitarianism, as against people who do these things, people like Smith and Montesquieu.
So Montesquieu, he wrote kind of allegorically about, he wrote the Persian allegory.
Persian letters, yeah. So he had an interesting life. He was a quite rich French aristocrat, and he was trained as a lawyer. He worked as a lawyer and a judge as a young man. He lived under first Louis XIV and then Louis XV, and he saw that things in France were not good. And then he spent some time in England. He saw how much better things were in England, and he got this wonderful idea. He wanted to write a book that showed how ridiculous the France he lived in was. So he wrote this book as a series of letters between a Persian diplomat in France, writing back to Persia. And it was both a way to make fun of a lot of the aspects of French society and French government, but it was also a way to expose how terrible things in the Islamic world were. But even that he originally published anonymously because France was so autocratic, he would have gotten in trouble, at least he thought, had he put his name on it. So it was published anonymously outside France. It was smuggled into France. It became kind of a sensation. Everybody wanted to read it because it was so entertaining and funny. And then finally he acknowledged, oh, yeah, I wrote that. And that was really the sort of beginning of his fame.
Have you read it?
Yeah, it's entertaining. It's interesting. It's very imaginative. Yeah, it's worth reading. I mean, is it the best thing I've ever read? No, but some parts of it are clever. I read it in English. It's very embarrassing. I'm married to a woman who's French, and I've tried to learn French, and so far with very little success.
So, who is the? If we had to like bring these people to the current day, and we had Machiavelli and Montesquieu, Hume, Locke, Smith, Kant, Heidegger, so forth. Who would you see them as amongst our current set of writers, thinkers, politicians, and so forth?
Well, I think there are two American philosophers who have lived within the last half century, one of whom is alive today, who are absolutely extraordinary figures. I think, among the great philosophers who've ever lived. And one of them has gotten an amount of due regard and one much less. The two are Eric Hoffer and Thomas Sowell. I think Thomas Sowell is one of the greatest living writers of any kind, certainly the greatest living philosopher. I think I've read every book he's written, and certainly not every article, but every book he's written, and I think they're all worth reading. I think what he's written about education is fascinating. He's written several books, including one called Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, which gets into some of the aspects of his own life. He's a black economist, black American conservative economist, who's at the Hoover Institute in California. He also wrote a fantastic book called Inside American Education. That's an expose of a lot that's wrong, both in primary and secondary schools and colleges. He's written several more straightforwardly philosophical books, somewhat influenced by Hayek. He would have also been a student of Milton Friedman and George Stigler at the University of Chicago. And in particular, extraordinary book, Knowledge and Decisions, one of the best books I've ever read, which is a very dry but serious book about some of the inherent need for a market economy and the problems of central planning. He wrote a fascinating book about philosophy called The Vision of the Anointed. There are a whole series of books he's written. He's written also now a series of books about the history of migration and culture that are brilliant. Just a remarkable man. And I think one of the great philosophers who's ever lived. And this is not just my opinion. Hayek said about Knowledge and Decisions, he said point blank, this man is a genius. So whether you're a libertarian or not a libertarian, I'm not a libertarian. Here's someone who's one of the great philosophers of modern times saying a genius without qualification.
Yeah. I love Thomas Sowell.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I've read, I'm sorry, we'll come back to Eric Hoffer in a second, but I love Thomas Sowell. I'm happy you said that. I never really thought of him as a philosopher per se, but maybe that's what philosophy is. I would add to the pantheon, one of my favorite topical seminal books for today is, I think it's either White Liberals, Black Rednecks, or Black Rednecks, White Liberal. I'm sure orders first. Yeah. But it really punctures so many myths of racism and so forth. And it's a crucial book. But it's a collection of his essays, and I've read his essays over time. And they're always sensical. He gets at some terms like affordable housing. He said, affordable housing, that's not affordable housing. When I was a grad student and so forth, I paid, my own story, personal Randy story, is when I was a medical student, I lived in affordable housing. I found a place where I had a tiny room, like 6 by 9. I could only fit a bed in it. And it was affordable because that's what I could afford. Sowell is good at puncturing kind of the myth names. In fact, the subsidized housing, you're expecting other people to pay for it, not genuinely affordable to you. You're not, if the right housing would be maybe a boarding house or something like that, all of which have disappeared. So we've changed our standards and concepts. And Thomas Sowell is so good at kind of giving perspective and puncturing that, but in a very easygoing kind of way without talking down to people. So I apologize for that. But Hoffer.
Well, just also to say about that he is a philosopher. One of the points he makes in Vision of the Anointed, as you say, he's great at puncturing Kant and the use of euphemisms and so forth. But one of the points he makes in, and this is taking off from Adam Smith, speaking of Adam Smith, one of the points he makes in Vision of the Anointed is that if you thought about two modern political figures who were really committed to the idea of good intentions, having the right intentions in your actions, near the top of the list would have to be Chairman Mao and Adolf Hitler. They both believed that the intention of the person was extremely important, and that you had the right intentions and the right motives was extremely important. And they're certainly among the worst people who've ever lived. But they believed that their followers had to act with good and what they considered good intentions. By contrast, he says, most of the inventions that have moved forward our lives and improved our lives and our civilization were done, at the point that Smith made, were done purely out of self-interest, were created out purely and marketed purely out of self-interest. Mm-hmm. So the idea that we have to have, some kind of goodness in our heart, that this is the key to advancing society. And you see it in the healthcare industry. The vast majority of great drugs that are being introduced, things like Ozempic, and what are these wonderful drugs, and Nurtec ODT, these are amazing drugs that are changing people's lives. The people did this out of profit motive. That's why they came up with these drugs. I mean, let's be real. And, Chairman Mao in the Cultural Revolution and Hitler in the Nazi cause, they may have been committed to their vision, but they didn't do a lot of good. But anyway, getting to Eric Hoffer, I think many people may not know, he used to be called the longshoreman philosopher. He had a fascinating life. It's only starting to be understood now because he told many things, he said many things about his own life and background, which seemed to be false. But what is certainly known is that he became a longshoreman in California. He was a professional dock worker, and he was self-educated, and he became very interested, and he read an enormous amount. He read, all the people we're talking about, along with people like Michelet, La Rochefoucauld, a vast amount of history. And he wrote a very short book that is, I think, one of the best books ever written. It's called The True Believer. And it's about why people join mass movements and what mass movements are about, whether they're religious or political, nationalistic. And it's a real consideration of history. It's a short book. It's a fun read. And it brought him worldwide fame. He became very unpopular because he was kind of a working class conservative, and he was very opposed to 60s radicalism. He was put on this government commission, I think it's called the Kerner Commission, by President Johnson. And unlike everybody else on the committee, he was not sympathetic to student radicals. And he kind of became very unpopular at that point among intellectuals. But an extraordinary, if you ask what are some of the best books I've ever read, I would definitely put that on the list. And it's about 150 pages. You can read it in maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Strike it up.
As I say, he probably misled people about who he actually was. He claimed that he had been born in the Bronx, New York, and raised in the Bronx in an Alsatian American family, and that he'd had an accident at age 5, which had left him blind. And then he'd been homeschooled to age 15 as a blind boy. And then somehow he'd regained his sight. He'd gone out to California. This is the account he gave of his life. He'd gone out to California, been suicidal, and worked as a migrant worker and miner, and then self-educated himself and had become this well-known intellectual. I think it's now acknowledged that this account of his life is false. he spoke with a German accent. Apparently, people who spoke to him in German said he did not have an Alsatian accent. He had a Bavarian accent in German. And there's no record of his family with his name in the Bronx. So I think the general assumption, also he knew Hebrew. So I think the general assumption is that he must have been a Jew who left Germany at the time of the rise of Hitler, got into the United States illegally, probably by walking from, Tijuana or something, without papers, and just claimed he'd grown up in the United States. Of course, in those days, you didn't really need a lot of documentation, and was actually someone who was highly educated before he became a member of the working class. And that also would explain one of the things he said was an inspiration for his book was he was curious. He wanted to understand how did Hitler gain power. Well, then, of course, that was a personal motivation. That seems to have been really what happened in his life. There had been biographies, but there's still a lot of questions.
Did he go on to have a family?
I'm sorry?
Did he marry and have a family?
He had a girlfriend, and he had a girlfriend for a long time, and she had a son, and it's generally believed that the son was his son, but he presented him as though the son was his adopted son. The whole thing is very strange.
Tricky. So I have not read him, not familiar. I like Milton Friedman. He's an economist, but is Milton Friedman a philosopher?
Well, he certainly, it's interesting. Of course, there's the connection. Sol was a student of Friedman's. A lot of what they were doing was discussing philosophical topics. And certainly Freedom to Choose is in many ways a work of philosophy. Hayek obviously was a philosopher, much more than an economist. And Sol seems to straddle the two, though I think in many ways he's more a philosopher than an economist. He's never been interested in, number crunch, model creation, or any of that. He did write a book, a textbook on economics, but it has no equations in it, no charts. It's a non-mathematical book of economics. It's for the layman. So, I would call him much more a philosopher, even a historian or sociologist, than an economist. But it is true he has a doctorate in economics and his training in economics. By the way, he also wrote it is dry, but he wrote an interesting book about Marxism as someone who, as a graduate student, had been a Marxist, had learned German partly to read Das Kapital in the original. So he actually has a lot of familiarity with Marxism, and he writes about it with more sympathy than someone like Paul Johnson or many of us have. I mean, he writes about it with some understanding of why Marx was taken seriously and what Marx's concepts of capital were intended to mean, whether or not they make any sense.
I didn't know that. Well, so Thomas Sowell was a self-proclaimed communist growing up as well. And I think all this kind of goes to Churchill's thesis that anybody not liberal when young has no heart. Anybody older, not conservative, has no brains. And I think people go through their changes. I'm going to interview Scott McKinney.
He wrote a book on Marxism, former Marxist. Yeah.
Say again?
I was talking about Sowell. Yeah, Sowell was the one who I was recommending wrote a book on Marxism. That's I think worth reading.
Okay, and not Friedman.
It's still Marxist.
Yeah. So if you're, I'd like to kind of get to your novel in serial form. I'm going to pop it up here so people can see it. Let's see.
I'm sorry I'm being so serious. This is not not my normal personality.
No, it's not all serious. It's fun and games, philosophy. So here's herd immunity. Maybe you have it serialized on your Substack,
right?
Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's a little bit of a novel of ideas, sort of a panoramic novel like Tom Wolfe. That's what a lot of people compared it to, but it's also a novel of ideas. So the main character, or one of the main characters, is a professor's an expert on cetaceans, dolphins, whales, and porpoises, and she's interested in and she's studying their language patterns, which of course many cetacean researchers are doing. They're trying to use computers to try and figure out what the extent of their language and, what it means and whether it's comparable to human language, et cetera. And we do know some things. For instance, we know that they do name, for instance, they name their children, which is also has been found that this is true with parrots, interestingly. But anyway, her main idea is that they're probably more like people than chimps and gorillas are, which I believe, by the way. And of course, they're a pack animal. They're an animal that's very attached to the group, and they display patterns of behavior we've never seen with primates, but we do see with humans. For instance, suicide, both individual and collective. They're very caught up with the group, as humans are. But it's also a novel about she has this kind of awful husband, and who's been cheating on her, and she starts having an affair with a graduate student, and then one of her former students is kind of caught up in the COVID pandemic. He's a musician, he can't make a living, and there's plenty of plot in this story. And there's also another character who's a DEA agent. He's investigating shipments of fentanyl from China. So there's a lot of plot, there's a lot of story, but in the background is this whole question of what are humans. And as we were just talking about, I believe, and I think a lot of people believe just observationally, we're much more of a herd animal than has been acknowledged.
Well, I think there's some of it. I don't want to push back too much, but I interviewed Paul Manger. He's in South Africa, and he's my favorite cetaceanologist. What do you call him? He's not a whale himself. He's not even from Wales. And he has the theory that the ratio of white matter to gray matter is much higher in the cetacean brain because they're in cold water, and there's basically they basically have a fatty insulated brain. A lot of the activity that goes on in their brains is just to keep the thing warm so it doesn't freeze up. If their fins freeze up, whatever. So they're hanging around in very, very cold water most all the time, no respite. So they're obviously, if you go in a cold bath of cold water naked, it's even worse than being outside at that same temperature in the air, because there's much higher conductivity of water on your skin. So here are these mammals sitting underwater, and they're warm-blooded and whatnot. So they have to kind of keep everything going, and their brains are big because not so much for thinking, but because they have to keep a certain amount of kind of like if you have those wires on, if you own a house, you keep wires around the pipe so they don't freeze in the winter. A lot of their brain is serving the secondary function, and he's really downplays some of their brilliant activities and things. A lot of the patterning things they can do are not that dissimilar to dogs and seals and whatnot. I like my dog, and I think he's cute and he understands some stuff, and probably whales would too, but they're not. I don't think they're deep thinkers. A lot of the noises they make, fine. I'm not an expert or anything like that, but I might send you his talk with me from probably 8 months ago or so. Anyway,
can I say a few things about that?
Yeah, go for it.
Could I say a few things about that?
Yeah.
Obviously, he knows a lot more about whales and dolphins than I do. It's a novel, but I would point out several things. First off, there are many species of dolphins, and the ones that seem to be the most intelligent are the Atlantic spotted dolphins, and they live in warm water. They don't live in cold water. They live in, a lot of them are in the Caribbean, where the water is warm year-round, probably warmer than a lot of places that humans live. Also, their brains are very different in a lot of fundamental ways. For one thing, we breathe as autonomically. That is, we don't think about what we're doing. Part of our brain that controls our breathing is automatic. They have to think to. It sounds weird, but they have to think to breathe. They also don't go to sleep in the way that we do. They have basically two sides to their brain. They shut off one side of the brain and that goes to sleep, and the other side stays awake. I know that sounds crazy, but that's how it works. It is and also they have a part of the brain which seems to be involved in emotional connection, which we don't have. So it seems to be more designed for emotional awareness in some ways than intellectual comprehension, which is consistent with our observation. They seem to be very emotionally connected to the pack in a really profound way. So I'm not saying that they're out in the water and they're just like us, except they're in the water. they're quite different in a lot of fundamental ways. Obviously, there's no question about it.
Yeah.
And by the way, one other thing, the comparison you made to dogs and seals, I think, is a very valid one, but one that speaks in their favor in terms of understanding their connection to humans. All these animals are cooperative hunters, which we are too. Prior to agriculture, humans got half or more of our calories from hunting. So we had to be very good, and we don't have, big canine teeth. We're not really good sprinters. We don't, we can't leap on other animals and kill them the way classic carnivores can, like big cats. So we had to learn how to work together, which is, of course, what dolphins and seals and dogs do. They work together to kill. And we had to learn that too. Chimps and gorillas don't do that very much. Chimps, 1 to 3% of their diet does come from hunting. They do hunt colobus monkeys very occasionally. There's a little bit of that with chimps. With gorillas, not at all. Gorillas are completely herbivorous. But the characteristics of the species that has to engage in cooperative hunting is you have to be able to listen and pay attention and follow directions, and you have to be somewhat obedient. And humans are those things. Of course, we're a tame animal, as are dolphins, as are dogs, as are seals. Primates are not. No primate is a tame animal. Not even the capuchin monkey, the so-called organ grinder monkey, is not truly a tame animal. And you cannot have a chimp or gorilla in your home once they get past a certain age. They will rip your arm off. They will pull your nose off. They will kill you. They're very different animals. And the fact that we're probably in many behaviorally much more like, as you mentioned, seals and dogs and dolphins. And they're all good at listening too, just like people. Listening and following orders, which is in many ways very dangerous. And it's one of the problems with humans that, they hear Hitler or Mao and he's spouting some kind of crazy nonsense and they follow them. We follow them. I should say we. And that's one of the problems with humans.
Well, we're kind of rounding out the hour a little bit, and I need to accelerate slightly because I have to be out of here for an appointment for my injury.
Yeah.
Who are this philosophy? I'm just going to leave you with maybe time for self-promotion and so forth. But how do people get philosophy now? I mean, is Jordan Peterson philosophic? Are they getting it through TikTok instead of reading?
I don't know. I don't know the answer. I wish I had a better answer. I hope they'll read my Substack. I hope my Substack will expose them to some philosophy. And I think some of the people, I'm really glad you brought up Adam Smith, because Smith was in many ways a philosopher. And he wrote stuff that was expressly philosophy, not economics. And, the tradition of which he's a part, which is empirical philosophy, going out and finding out what's true and trying to draw inferences from that. That's, to me, the best part of for the most part, the best part of philosophy. And this kind of conjectural philosophy, which, Plato was part of, Heidegger's part of, where you just kind of come up with a theory and you don't need any evidence, you don't present any evidence, is often very dangerous. And a lot of the people who have been promoting it are people who are megalomaniacs, and their followers have often turned out to be quite dangerous. Yeah. So yeah, I would love if people would read my Substack, but I also think, read the people who have been influential in developing our form of government, like Montesquieu and Locke, the great commentators on our form of government, like de Tocqueville. These were sane, reasonable people, and they were successful people in their own lives, which should, why would you study a philosopher if he was obviously deranged and unsuccessful in living his own life? Yet that describes many of the most famous philosophers. Nietzsche was certainly a genius, but he died in a mental institution. Heidegger was this angry cuckold, who ran a university on behalf of the Nazis and was a big supporter of the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Wittgenstein came from this unbelievably rich family, probably the richest family in Austria. The family paid off the school children that he badly, badly beat when he was working as an elementary school teacher. And at one point, he wanted to give up his life as a philosopher and go to serve Stalin in Russia and work as like an industrial laborer. You could go on and on. A lot of these famous philosophers were not high-functioning people. They were weird, unsuccessful people in their daily lives. And that in itself should raise questions about, I know what I'm saying is ad hominem, but it should raise questions
I think
about
it's very useful.
how reliable is sources.
I read Paul Johnson's book on intellectuals, and I read Daniel J. Flynn's book similarly. And I think it kind of parses out to the people who bring better advice, the people who are able to manage better their own lives. I mean, it's almost like axiomatic and obvious.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thanks so much for being with me, Jonathan. I'm going to pop in self-promotion, as you mentioned earlier. My Zika book's still there. All you have to do is buy one, and it'll self-create. Amazon will print one out and send it right to you wherever you are on Earth. It's being published in Brazil separately by an actual publisher, and I hope to get the message out. And I really appreciate what your kind words about my book. And Kirkus Reviews also gave it a good review. I don't have it up here. They noticed one typo in the book at the time, which is kind of a funny one because it's nonsensical. I dictated a lot of the book. When I was in the editing phase, I had the microphone thing on. I must have said something to somebody. So it's just kind of like middle of a sentence, like, what do you want right now? It's like, so they said, we need a better editor. But it's kind of one of those quirky things that just happens to happen. And I'd had that book edited by people, gone over it, but it's just in the final phases when I was, putting figures and diagrams, I apparently had the dictation on, unbeknownst to me. Anyway, that's in the Kirkus Review, but not in the book anymore. So thank you so much, Jonathan. I hope we can talk again soon. And we'll see if we have some confluence. I do have a movie treatment written by Daniel Jupp on the Zika phenomenon. It's not factual per se, but it's, interesting, and it uses some facts from the Zika microcephaly pandemic panic. And maybe you can add some thoughts to that. And I wish you very much success with your writing. I have your play, The Germans in Paris. Very interesting and fun read. You're a bright intellect yourself, so I'm glad we have you around.
Thank you so much. And again, I just mentioned about both City of Angles and your book. If people don't know this, Kirkus is notoriously difficult, famously difficult. To get a good review in Kirkus is very difficult. And they only generally do it for books that are worth reading. So these are books worth reading. People should go out and get them.
Yeah. Well,
and thank you. Thank you, Dr. Becker.
Yeah, that was a good point. So let's see, just like for a second, if I can. Well, here's mine. I can pop it up. So a provocative peek into real life mechanics of the scientific process, and they should put sick after that because a lot of this was not scientific. At any rate, here's their review. You can go find it on Kirkus Reviews. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being with me today. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank